Hi everyone. So in this our last video in our series on the nervous system, we are going to be talking about the brain. Now, one thing I do want to state is that this is going to be a very generalistic overview of the brain and its main functions based on what you need to know on the secondary 3 curriculum. If you look at other videos on the brain, it is going to go into much more detail than I do. So this is, again, is just a very cursory overview of the brain, its main components, its main divisions, and its main lobes. So lots of other videos will have much more detail, and I do highly suggest that you check out some of those videos because they're very, very interesting about the brain, and the brain is just one of those organs where there's so much to learn about the brain, and we're still learning a lot about the brain. But again, this is just a general overview. So let's get started. So the brain, first and foremost, is a large mass of nerve cells, which pretty much makes sense because if we think about the brain, it is the controller of the body. It processes all of information. It processes stimuli from internal sources and external sources. It determines what's happening. It releases hormones, neurotransmitters, causing the organization of your different organs to function in sync with each other. So it needs to have a very, very large mass of nerve cells to be able to do that. Now, because it is the, quote unquote, controller of the body, it needs to be protected. And this is done by the cranium, which again is the bone that is specifically tailored to protect and cover the brain. Now, recap to the types of bones that we have in the body. So we have long bones, which are your bones that you have in your limbs. We have short bones, which, as the name suggests, are very short. So you find them in your wrist and in your ankles. And we have flat bones, which is characterized by two layers of compact tissue, which is the very, very dense bone material, and one layer of spongy tissue, which is in the middle. So quote unquote the Oreo cookie type bone. And then we have the irregular bone. So the cranium would be considered a flat bone because it's relatively mostly compact bone with a very, very thin layer of spongy bone in the middle. So we have the cranium, that is the bone that is protecting the brain. And we also have meninges, which are basically layers of connective tissue, which is in between the cranium and in between the brain. So there's three key meninges. We have the dura mater, which is Latin for tough material. It's the outer layer. It attaches one side of it attaches to the cranium, the other side attaches to the middle layer, and the dura mater has a lot of drainage system for cerebral spinal fluid to drain. The arachnoid matter is in between the dura mater, which is the outer layer of the meninges, and the pia mater, which is the inner layer of the meninges. And it's called the arachnoid matter because it kind of looks like a web, and spiders make webs, so arachnoid matter. And then the inner matter is called the pia mater. So you have blood vessels here, and cerebrospinal fluid is found here. So the next thing that you have surrounding the brain is, as I've mentioned a couple of times, cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid, as the name suggests, is found in both the brain and found in your spinal cord. And it pretty much has two functions. One, it acts as a cushioner. So it basically protects the brain and the spinal cord from injury. Liquids are very good at absorbing shock. So it's really good at absorbing shock. So that's the first function. And then the second function of cerebrospinal fluid is this is where liquids, where nutrients and waste can travel in between. Because recap, the neuron requires a ridiculous amount of glucose and oxygen to function. So this is the medium, so the cerebrospinal fluid, you can have nutrients and waste going to and fro inside of it. So let's look at the parts of the brain. So if we're looking at this right here, first and foremost, the brain is all of these structures right here. So our brain is this structure right here. this structure right here, and this structure right here. So within the brain itself, we have 3 distinct components. We're going to get to that in a second. Now, the bone that surrounds our brain is our cranium. So the scientific name for the skull is the cranium. And then right in between the cranium and the brain, we have our meninges. Now, our brain is actually broken up into 3 components. The largest part of the brain, so all of this right here, this is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest component of the brain, and that's pretty much the same for all mammalian brains. All mammalian brains have 3 components, and no matter the species, the cerebrum is the largest. Then you have the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is this small part right here. Cerebellum is actually Latin for little brain, so it's smaller than the cerebrum. And then we have our last component, which is the brain stem. So we're going to look a little bit into more detail about what each of the components do. Okay, so first and foremost, we have the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is by and far the largest component of the brain. It's also under voluntary control. And when we're talking about voluntary control, it means you have to think about doing something for it to be processed, which is different from involuntary control, which is it happens regardless if you're thinking about it or not. So an example of something that is under voluntary control, picking up, squeezing the stress ball. You have to consciously think of moving the muscles in your hand to pick up the stress ball and squeezing. So that would be voluntary control. Something that's under involuntary control, breathing. During all of this time, I did not have to think of my diaphragm contracting and relaxing. I did not have to think of my intercostal muscles contracting and relaxing. So anything that happens without conscious thought, involuntary control. Now, our cerebrum is extremely important. It's key in movement, senses, emotions, intelligence, physiological functions, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail about that. The cerebrum, which is again Latin for little brain, is also under voluntary control, and it controls balance and movement coordination. And then our brain stem, and our brain stem is under involuntary control. So it's all of the muscle movement that you are not consciously thinking of. So examples of muscle movement that you are not consciously thinking of would be things like breathing, things like swallowing, things like the heart contracting. Okay, things like digestion all require muscle contractions, all happen without you thinking about it. So what we have right here are the cerebrum. So again, the cerebrum is separated into different lobes. So, and all of these separations, so all of these general areas, what separates them are things called sulcus, which basically is also considered grooves or fissures. And all of these grooves and fissures separate our different lobes. So we pretty much have 4 lobes that you have in the cerebrum. The first one is our frontal lobe. So if we're looking at a side profile of the brain, the frontal lobe would be basically the lobe in the front. And it's key in personality, decision making, movement, smell, understanding language, emotions, speech. Then we have behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. So this is key in spatial awareness. So where you are with respect to things around you, key with touch and pressure sensation and understanding language. Then we have the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is in the back, and this is involved in vision, so sight interpretation. And then we have the temporal lobe. So this is again involved in speech, musical rhythm, hearing, emotion, and memory. Now these again are very, very overview generalizations of what happens in each of these lobes. There's lots of cross communication between the different lobes. And as you might have noticed, if you're looking at all of the functions of different lobes, you'll see that like speech ability is happening in frontal lobe, understanding language is happening in parietal lobe. So basically the area of the brain that's doing these things is going to be in between both the frontal and the parietal lobe. And there's a lot of like cross communication that happens between each of these lobes of where something is happening in one lobe and then another process information is happening in other lobes. Again, I'm being very generalistic and I'm being very, very not specific in this video. There are multiple videos that go into distinct areas of the brain that are focused on distinct parts of speech, personality, memory retention that we are not going to be going into for this level of this class. Now, our brain, we can't really see it from this image, but it's actually separated into two hemispheres. So the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So whereas interpreting speech can happening in one side of the hemisphere, the information of getting the sound happens in another part of the hemisphere. So what causes the both sides of the brain to talk to each other is a structure that is in between both hemispheres, which is called the corpus callosum, which is basically a bundle of nerve fibers that go from our left hemisphere and connect to the right hemisphere to allow for integration of information and coordination. Now, the corpus callosum is actually Latin for tough body because you have over 200 million nerve fibers, and it allows for the interconnectedness between one hemisphere and the other hemisphere. Because again, one part of speech can be entering the left hemisphere, and then the interpretation of that can be discussed in the right hemisphere. Now, you do actually have disorders where you don't have a functioning corpus callosum or the corpus callosum due to other issues like um, other neurological issues where the corpus callosum gets damaged. And one genetic condition called the agenesis of the corpus callosum is when you're actually born without a corpus callosum. So the structure that mediates between the left and right hemisphere you don't have. And lots of physiological and developmental issues happen because of this. So it's actually really important that we have a structure that connects both sides of our brains together. So we have actually another image right here that is showing where different parts of speech, intelligence, emotion, sensory reception, and sensory interpretation happen in the cerebrum, and we can see a lot of interacting and overlapping. So that's the amount of detail that we're going into the brain. Again, this was a very quick overview of the parts of the brain, and there's lots more information in certain other websites and other videos, which I can highly suggest to you. But again, for what we need to know in this class, this is pretty much our overview that we need to know. Now, the brain, super important, all of the processing that you have in your body. But we're also missing another part of our central nervous system that needs to take information to and from the brain, which is our spinal column. So our spinal column is the bundle of nerves that takes information from the body and sends it to the brain, and also takes the brain's response and sends it to the body. So it is also protected by bone. So it's protected by vertebrae. And if we think about the types of bones that we have in our body, vertebrae are irregular bones. And there's also, just like the brain, meninges in between the bone and the spinal column. So we actually have two types of matter in our spinal column. We have our gray matter and our white matter. So the gray matter is on the inside, very, very dense dense material, and there are white matters on the outside. Then both of that matter is surrounded by our meninges, which again is our protective connective tissue that is in between our spinal column and our spinal nerves. And then the one thing that we don't see in this image, but again would be surrounding this, is again our vertebrae, which is the bone that protects our spinal column. Thanks for watching.